poll that we just conducted is the third wave of our National Suburban Survey. We did our first two surveys last year, right around the time of the election. We found that a large number of suburbanites were struggling economically. Sometimes they had lost a job, they had had cuts in their wages and hours at work. At times they'd even lost their houses through foreclosure. This year we asked many of the same questions, and we found that suburbanites were even more pinched. What we also did this year was that we collected subsamples within the suburbs of suburban African Americans and Hispanics. And we found that those groups were particularly hard hit by the economic crisis. What was interesting about the Obama numbers was that compared to last year, it seemed that some of his support in the suburbs had faded. And from what we could tell, part of the reason was that people in the suburbs did not feel as though the government's economic policies were helping them, that they were going to improve their financial situation. Now, one complication to that is that when we looked at the numbers for people of color in the suburbs, support for Obama remained strong, even though those are precisely the groups that were hardest hit by the economic crisis. There are a couple of important findings about race relations in the suburbs. First, it seemed that on the surface, race relations were pretty good, and there are reasons to be optimistic about them. Whites and African Americans said that they generally got along with other racial groups in their communities. The picture wasn't as optimistic or as positive for Hispanic groups. For Hispanic groups, about a third of Hispanics said that they generally did not get along with whites and Asian Americans, and 45% said that they didn't have great relations with African Americans. Another interesting finding was that even though whites and African Americans said that race relations were relatively positive and that racial groups in their communities generally got along, all racial groups still saw persistent discrimination against African Americans, Latinos, and as well as other groups like immigrants, Muslims, and the poor. So there's a sense that even though people get along relatively well on a day-to-day basis, they still believe that society as a whole discriminates against many of these racial groups. The conference is important for a couple of reasons. We're really doing three things with the conference. We're bringing together academics that look into the past at the history of suburban diversity, academics that look to the present and the future and try to examine what growing suburban diversity means. And we're also trying to bring people who work in the nonprofit sector and the public sector and so on into conversation with those first two groups about how to make the suburbs a more inclusive place. The great thing about the conference is that we have both academic sessions and also panels. And often those academic sessions and panels reflect one another. So we have academic sessions and panels, and the academic sessions bring scholars together to discuss a certain topic, say education financing, and then the panels, which often run back-to-back with those sessions, will bring together experts from outside of the academy to discuss the same topics. And so in many ways we get both the academic perspective and the non-academic perspective. Many of the topics that we're covering are also of particular importance in places like Long Island. So we're trying to look at education financing, for instance, and equity in education financing. We're looking at policing. We're looking at immigration issues. And so I think that many people in the community and in this area are going to find these conversations particularly interesting. They often feature not only regional experts, but experts from around the country, again, both experts inside and outside of the academy. There are many connections between the conference and the poll, and in many ways they reflect one another. So, for example, in the poll, we asked several questions about people's housing, about whether they had gone through foreclosure and so on. And in our conference, we're going to have a lot of discussion about affordable housing and about housing provision on Long Island. As we know, Long Island is both a place that has been hard hit by foreclosures, and at the same time it remains, almost paradoxically, a relatively unaffordable place to live. Even after the economic crisis, housing is still relatively expensive. And so that's one of many ways in which there's a connection between the poll and the conference. Again, in the poll we asked about attitudes towards immigrants and immigration. And in the conference, we're going to be having several sessions that deal with immigration in suburban areas. So that's a place in which, you know, a place where the conference and the poll come together, where there's a nexus between the conference and the poll that we've just conducted.